We'd like to welcome Dr. Rex Bernardo, who is, well, we all should know him if you're plant breeding students with the amount of textbook reading we've done to get through our degree programs. He's the professor and endowed chair in maize breeding at the University of Minnesota, and he has very graciously agreed to host this hands-on workshop. And NAPB is very thankful for his time. Me and Dr. Coburn, Janie's in here. She and I had the opportunity of participating at one of his workshops, the breeding games at ASA meetings, I believe in 2018. We even won that. So it was really, we have fond memories of, doing workshops with him, and I'll pass it on to him. If you have any
Thank you.
questions, please mute yourselves and raise your question in the chat. One of us will get to it. If there's a technical issue that we can help with, also please go ahead and type it up, or send me an email on the other account if you just completely get booted out of this. Rex, you have the floor.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you today from cloudy Minneapolis, where it is a not too bad 21 degrees this Friday. So, what I'll be sharing with you today is based on a course that I teach regularly at the University of Minnesota. In fact, I'm teaching it this semester, and it is a course entitled Professional Skills for Scientists. This course came about a few years ago when I emailed my former students who had finished their master's or PhD degrees with me. And I asked them, what are some of the things that you wish you learned in graduate school, but we did not teach you? And you had to learn the hard way in your current employment, which was mainly industry positions. And the answers were quite interesting. They were fairly uniform. A lot of the answers had to do with dealing with people, dealing with those who report to me, or dealing with my boss, or communication, or making budgets, and those sorts of things, those sorts of soft skills or professional skills that we often do not have formal training, but we just learn by doing or by imitating. And so after I heard that, I figured, you know what? There's no reason for us to not provide such formal training as part of our curriculum. And we're not fooling ourselves. I mean, these are skills that you cannot learn overnight, but a lot of it is awareness that these are things that we need to be learning and preparing ourselves for before we enter the workplace. So that when we are aware of these things, at least when we encounter a situation, then it's something we've thought about before. And also in this course, we begin to develop some very basic skills that pertain to these different issues. So a challenge for me dealing with preparing for this workshop today is, how do I compress a semester long course into a quick 3-hour crash course on professional skills for scientists? So for today, what I've done is I've chosen 6 topics that pertain with different professional skills that I think I've had to learn, and that I think you're learning and you'll encounter even more as you finish. I'm assuming most here are graduate students or postdocs, but there might be early career or even later career scientists. But these concepts and principles and practices do apply regardless of your stage of career, and these are things that you continue to refine and learn. You learn by doing. And so what I'm going to do here now is share my screen. There you go. I'll be writing on notes. Those old timers here, maybe if you were in middle school, you might remember overhead transparencies used by your second grade teacher or something like that. So this is just a camera, and I'll be writing on paper. You must have received this handout, as Nia indicated, and so I'll be annotating these notes later on. Um, how I'm going to structure this is, there are 6 parts here. We'll spend roughly then about half an hour for each part, maybe 20 minutes for presentation and 10 minutes for question in the end. And then we'll have a break somewhere in the middle. All right. So what our tour or journey this afternoon, our menu, so to speak, I'll be speaking about the life cycle, what I call the life cycle of a scientist. how it is to work in industry versus academe versus a nonprofit organization. What are some ways by which we can handle conflict? Fourth topic is quite interesting. It's managing your bosses. We think of managing those who are under our supervision, but there's also managing up or managing your boss. We're going to talk a little bit about effective communication. And finally, as minor as this seems, meetings are a huge part of the workplace today. And so just some good practices on how we can run effective meetings. All right. So without further ado, unless there are any general questions that you'd like to ask, are there any general questions? Hearing none, let's move on to this very first part, what I call as the life cycle of a scientist. And so if people have, those who have studied this field closely, have found that workers or scientists typically go through different stages in their careers. And it is helpful to be aware of these stages and to see where we are and to actually project where we might want to be later on in our careers. And so these four stages are as follows. One is contributing dependently. The second is contributing independently. The third will be contributing through others. And the fourth would be contributing strategically. So what I'd like to do, well, let me explain this first, and then we'll take a poll later on. As the name implies, well, if you're contributing dependently, it basically means that you're working under someone else's supervision. You're working under someone's supervision. Pardon my handwriting. I'm writing at an awkward position here. Typically, your work is part of a larger project. Sometimes it is routine. And so if you're a grad student right now or a postdoc, a lot of your work would be contributing dependently in the sense that you are contributing in large part through your advisor. You're working under your supervisor or your advisor's supervision and mentorship. It means that your work is actually a part of a larger project. And if you think about it, your specific thesis project, your specific dissertation or master's thesis, it is part of the larger research project that your advisor is doing. And some of your work might be really, really exciting, and some of the work might be routine. For me, when I was a graduate student, the routine part of the work was counting corn seeds. So I had to count manually corn seeds into packets. I'd count by 5, 10, 15, and 20. And I did that for an entire winter. And one time I was counting corn, I was making a drink, a tang, and I was counting the spoonfuls of tang. And I was counting 5, 10, 15, 20 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. And I go, oh boy, I've been counting too much by 5. But but the work had to be done, and it was routine, and you just have to do it. This part here, you might think, well, when I'm done with grad school, then I'm done with this whole idea of working, of contributing dependently. Actually, that is not quite true. Well, when you start with the industry, it doesn't necessarily end in grad school. Meaning that if you go to the industry and you get your first industry position, your first few months or year or so, you'll still be contributing independently in the sense that you'll be learning the ropes in your new industry position, and you'll be depending a lot on others. A key to success here, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is that you need a good mentor. You need a good mentor who would take you under his or her wing and basically shepherd you to this next stage. That this mentor will show you how to go to this next stage then of contributing independently. When you start to contribute independently, as the name implies, now you have your own project or area of responsibility. You still have your own project, and your work is part of a larger project, and you need to coordinate with other projects. It used to be that when you're in grad school, yes, your thesis is part of a larger project, but much of that coordination was done by your supervisor. And now, when you're beginning to contribute independently because you have responsibility for your own project, you'll need to see how your project or your area of responsibility fits in the larger scheme, and you'll need to coordinate with others. The many of the relationships from contributing dependently, it is a mentor-mentee relationship. When you get to this stage, it is more of a peer relationship. You have more peer relationships that develop, meaning that you're at that same level, so to speak. And lastly, when you contribute independently, you need to begin to develop confidence in your own judgment. You need to develop confidence in your own judgment, in that your peers or your supervisors maybe will ask you for your opinion or judgment on this or that. And even in grad school or in the academe, you see that the area of contributing independently, for example, when scientific journals or editors now ask you to review work that has been submitted for publication. Instead of relying on your advisor, now you begin to stand on your own 2 feet. And an editor might ask you, hey, can you review this? Would you be willing to review this paper? Is it acceptable for publication? What revisions are needed? Should the paper be released? And so again, that's a concrete example of somebody who is contributing independently being asked to exercise on judgment, okay? Now, the third stage then would be when you move from this stage to the next. And by the way, these are not discrete. There's a lot of overlap between these 2 stages. And it might be that although you might be in one stage mainly, that you're still doing aspects of the job, of your work that span the previous stage or the next stage. The next one is when you're contributing through others, and that is when you become a mentor, or you become an idea person in your organization, or when you become a manager. All right. In here, what you'll need to do is actually develop a broader interest. Because you are contributing through others, you begin to develop a broader interest in other disciplines. And you begin to see this with faculty members or even members of your committee or your advisor. And you'd think, you know what, my advisor, I know, studied this specific field in grad school. But now my advisor is going into phenomics or genomics or data science that maybe wasn't even invented yet when he or she was in grad school. But you see now your professor having this broader interest, and that is an aspect that you see from those who begin to contribute through others. Because of the larger areas of responsibility here, it is here where people skills become quite important. And again, because you now are managing or mentoring other people, this here, the topic that we're talking about today, although important in every stage, becomes really important when you begin to contribute through others. And lastly, the fourth stage is now when someone begins to contribute strategically. And this means that this person becomes more of an institutional leader. And it can be formal in terms of a formal job title, or it can be informal, meaning that the title, job title hasn't changed, but in some form or fashion, that this person is providing strategic leadership to the organization. When somebody gets to this stage, then relationships with outside entities become more important, increasingly important. For example, in the academe, an example of somebody who contributes strategically would be a department head or a dean. And we know that a department head or dean deals not only within the department or the college, but has to deal with outside entities within the university or outside entities outside of the university, such as stakeholders and professional organizations and other types of organizations. And when somebody gets to this stage, then the whole idea of transition planning or succession planning becomes important, meaning that a person here might be more advanced in age, and that idea of, well, who takes the leadership reins, that becomes more important, and that takes planning, because if that doesn't happen, then the organization will suffer as a whole. So that's a brief overview of these four life stages in the life cycle of a scientist, if you would. I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly here. And what I'd like to do now is do a poll, and I'll share this poll through the chat. We'll see if the poll works. We're doing it outside of Zoom rather than inside Zoom. So I'm going to put this poll, I'm going to paste it in the chat. Just a minute here. All right. If you all could go to this Google poll that I put on the chat and answer the questions to that poll, and then I'll share the answers with the rest of the group. I'll give you just not too long to do it. Let me know though if you're unable. I don't know if you're able to open the poll. We'll
It's
see.
needing some kind of permission.
Yeah, it says only the
Okay.
organization can use it.
Okay. That's a fail then, and that is perfectly fine. Let me go back here. All right, we'll do it another way. Okay. If I could have, here's what I'd like you to think about. Think about what stage you're in. You know what? If it's okay, I actually would like to see faces. So feel free to turn on your video for a while. There you go. Hey, Sunli, good to see you.
Hi, Rex.
Hi. All right. First question is that I'd like you to think about which of these four stages you're in right now. Are you stage one, contributing dependently; stage two, contributing independently; stage three, contributing through others; stage four, contributing strategically? All those who are contributing dependently, raise your hand through Zoom, through the Zoom icon or emoji or whatever you call it, or both. Okay. Zoom tells me how many raised their hands. That is great. All right. So 11 participants have raised their hands. So out of the group of 42, about a quarter consider themselves as contributing dependently. Now you could put your hands down. Second is those who are contributing independently. That is stage two. Raise your hand if you are in that stage of contributing independently. All right. There are about 10, 11 who have raised their hands. Thank you so much. You could put your hands down. If you are now in this stage of being a mentor to others and contributing through others, would you kindly raise your hand? All right. Fantastic. There are 3. can put your hands down. And last one, if you are in this last stage of contributing strategically, would you raise your hand? Okay, I have three who have raised their hands. They say they're in stage 4. Thank you so much. You can put your hands down. That all doesn't quite add up to 43. That means that a few of you aren't contributing in any way. I'm just kidding here. That's perfectly fine. All right, next question. And this is, well, yeah, we can do this by raising of hands as well. In your opinion, do you think everybody has to go to stage 4, contributing strategically? Or do you think it's possible to still be very successful in your career as a scientist or plant breeder, but to actually not go through that last stage, but to stay or end your career on stage 3, which is contributing through others? Those who think that it is possible not to go through all 4 stages, please raise your hand again. All right, about 15, 17, 18, and okay. Those, you can put your hands down. Those who think that to call your career upon your retirement, to call your career a successful career, you need to go through that 4th stage. Raise your hand. Okay, thank you. There are 4 participants to raise your hand, to raise their hands. All right. In general, the agreement among the experts here is, in general, you can be successful in your career without going through that last stage. The danger, though, is staying in stage 1 for too long, or staying in stage 2 for too long. In fact, they did studies of looking at age and where you are in your career. And if you're a certain age, say 40 or so, and you're still in stage 1, according to the sign, that was actually tied to the performance level in the particular job, that people are staying in that first stage just because they're not being as productive as they can be. All right, now I'd like to open the floor for questions about this first part of our workshop today, the life cycle of a scientist. If you hear, you might hear my wife in the background. We're working from the same small condo here in Minneapolis. So that's just the work from home situation that we all are all in. So please excuse that. But yes, if you have questions, do unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
Hi, Carl here.
Hi, Carl.
With some of these categories, it seems as if like it depends on what you're doing, where you can go in between them. Or some of these stages, like working on a larger project or doing something meticulous like seed counting. It's part of your own project. So it seems like it's like you go back and forth between these sometimes.
Yes, you do go back and forth. And for example, if I think of myself as an example, I think I'm now, for most of my career, I've been in stage 2 and 3. Okay, I've been stages 2 and 3 for a large part of my career. Just beginning last year, I formally moved into stage 4. And I say that because I founded and started directing a plant breeding center on our campus. And so that is a form of institutional leadership. I'm now responsible for this center with faculty members, students, postdocs who are loosely affiliated. And so I'm finding myself doing more and more of that. I'm actually finding myself doing less and less of the 3rd stage, contributing through others, just because my funding levels are low and I do not have as many graduate students now as I usually have. But now I've also found myself doing more of stage 2, of contributing independently. because now without too many graduate students, and I don't I'd rather have graduate students, but now that I don't have many, I have a bit more time on my hands, and I can pursue types of research that are mainly of interest to me and contribute that way, and have single author publications that way. So now, if I were to characterize my work, actually, which is stages 2 and 4, which is kind of weird, but that's just the way it is. And again, it doesn't mean you cannot go back from one to the other. It's common for department heads to say, okay, I'm done being department head. I want to go back to teaching. I want to go back to research. And the department head might step down and do that sort of thing. And again, there's no threshold, no strict cutoff point between these, but it's more of a continuum or a progression, if you would, that we see in the careers of scientists. And we do see these in breeders, in plant breeders, particularly those who go to the industry. You start out, you have your own project, and then soon enough, or not before too long, if you're a successful or a good worker, soon enough you are moved up up the chain of command, so to speak, in the seed industry, and you're given larger amounts of responsibility for projects and people. And before too long, you might find yourself more in a leadership type of position. And I see that in my grad students from, say, 12 or so years ago, that they are now doing more of that fourth stage, which is nice to see. So yeah, it's a progression to be aware about. And I think it is also a helpful exercise for each of us, even though it's not an easy thing to do. But even picture yourself, okay, you might be a PhD student right now, and all you want to do is survive. All I wanted to do is survive this pandemic and write my thesis and defend my dissertation and find my first job. Well, that is all good and great, but I think it's helpful to think beyond that. What about in 5 years? What about in 10 years, 15 or so? Where might I envision myself when I look at my career in the long run? And again, it's the awareness of that I think is important, and that we as scientists ought to be doing. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I have one. So I said, I kind of raised my hand on, I know that I'm 3. I feel like part of your definition of 4, I kind of fit into. I'm not institutional leader yet, but I am working with a lot of different organizations on specific topics. So outside entities and being involved in research in that aspect. But I guess I was more curious if strategically you're talking more about an institutional leader in that capacity, or kind of the way that I interpreted it.
It's more the way that you interpret it, meaning that you could have exactly the same title. You could have exactly the same job title as you did a decade ago. Yeah, that might be easier to see with a professor. Okay, you get promoted to full professorship. 10 years later, guess what? There's no rank in terms of the faculty rank. That's it, professor. And you're still a professor, no change in title, but you're actually doing a lot more institutional leadership. For example, even coordinating large grants, multi-institutional, multidisciplinary types of grants. To me, that is contributing strategically. And no formal job title, but the description of the work is really what is important.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
Yes, I have one. Here's Eduardo. So I have a question about how we can easily move between these categories, because right now I'm in stage 2, but I know it's kind of a big gap between 2 and 3, to move along. So what is your advices to become easier, or what we can do to have this easy transition?
That's a great question that I'd like to throw back to the group for any comments before I answer it. Any thoughts regarding Eduardo's question? How do I move from one stage to the other? Do you move, or does somebody move you? In fact, so it's a little bit of both in a way. But your thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I just want to add on because sometimes I feel like, oh, it's just a position, but mentally it's totally different when you are moving, not just about the job title, you know?
Okay, so one thing is that, as I mentioned, you should expect to move, because if you're stuck in the earlier stages in particular for a long time, um, that might not be a good sign. And so you should expect to move, but you cannot rush that either. You don't want to move from one stage to the other before you're ready. In the same way that there are things in grad school that you cannot rush. You can say, oh, I can finish all my coursework in a year and a half and take my prelims in the end of year 2 and write my thesis in a year. I actually kind of did that. And when I got done with grad school, I go, wow, there are a lot of things I learned, and maybe I shouldn't have rushed through it. You know, in hindsight, there really wasn't a reason to do so. So one, you cannot rush things. Two, I think it takes some initiative. It takes some initiative, and to move from one stage, particularly, I think through the last three, you need to show some expertise, knowledge, and initiative. I mean, things just won't happen unless somebody makes it happen, and sometimes that might have to be you, perhaps with the prodding of somebody else. But it's more okay. There's this large grant proposal, call for applications from the USDA. Oh, I have networks with this person in this university and this person in another university. Maybe I can be involved in making it happen. Maybe not just by myself, but I can partner with somebody else. And so I think, this is, you do have to exercise some initiative for you to move from one stage to the other, because chances are nobody's going to do it for you. I mean, somebody might promote you, say, within the organization, but it's only because they'll see your talent and initiative and your hard work that they might be willing to do that and identify you as a good candidate for this specific management or leadership type of position. Right?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, Sandra.
I'm a new assistant professor, so I'm in the process of transitioning from stage 2 to stage 3.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So what, in your experience, and this is probably different for every lab, but what is the ideal number of graduate students? Like, what is the range that kind of fit well for your lab?
I think you're absolutely right. It depends on what your comfort level is. For me, it was always 4 students. That seemed to be my magic number. Whenever I had 4, for me, 1 or 2 is a bit on the low side, because it's not a big enough core of people to be vigorously exchanging ideas, for example. When I get to 4, it seems like, for me anyway, a large enough group, a good core group, but yet I can still devote personal attention to each one. Now, I know professors have been really successful, and they have groups of 30 people. That's not me. I shake my head and I go, well, how do you do this? Well, how they do it is they have a lot of help. They have a lab manager, they have multiple postdocs who can help mentor graduate students, and those sorts of arrangements. So I think you'll have to find what your comfort level is. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more actually in the next part, when we talk about academe versus industry and nonprofit and consulting or independent contractor types of positions. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next. And we're on time. How about that? Working in the industry versus academe versus nonprofit organization, although we'll focus more on industry versus academe. Before I share my screen, I'd like you to raise your hands. What is your preferred type of employer? Is it industry or academe? If you prefer industry, would you raise your hand? All right. I have 16 participants who said they prefer industry. If you prefer academe, raise your hand. Wow, 14 raised their hands. This is excellent. In the class I teach, there's very few would like to go into an academic position. How about if you don't have a strong preference and either industry or academe, you're willing to explore them, and it would just depend on what job offer you might get? Raise your hand. Okay, I have 2. Okay, those who would like to work with a nonprofit organization, although the definition of a nonprofit is rather loose, those who'd like to work with a nonprofit organization, raise your hand. Okay, we have 6 or 7. Thank you. And lastly, if none of these appeal to you and you'd like to be an independent contractor or a consultant, raise your hand. Be your own boss, totally. All right, we have 3 bosses here in the group. 3 who said they'd like to be an independent contractor or consultant. Thank you so much. What I'd like to do now is share my screen and go through the second handout that we have, and just different characteristics, if you would, of an industry position versus an academic type of position. So if we look at the goal of an industry, and I think we're all plant breeders here, so we can talk about, if we look into the goal of the seed industry, the goal of the seed industry of a company is to make money. And that's a positive. It's mainly to make money. And you could add money and in the process do good. Do good in the sense that, for example, you're providing a product in terms of cultivars, you're providing services to producers, you're doing good as you go about that work of the industry, and yet the main goal is making money. In the academe, as we all know, it has to do, the main goals are teaching, research, and outreach. Or another way, if I could put it a bit more bluntly, is to do good and in the process spend money. Because these things cost money. So the industry, you make money, in the process do good. In the academe, you do good, and in the process spend money in the form of tuition dollars or support from the state legislature or support from grants and contracts. So these are two different goals, and both are good, both are valuable. But if you're entering one or the other, it's nice to know what the overall goal of the organization is, and that you are willing to be in line with that. The level of engagement in the industry is quite high. It is high because oftentimes, specifically in a breeding program, you work with complex projects or complex processes. If you think of breeding programs for major crops these days, like corn and soybean, these are fairly complex breeding programs. If you think of the need for seed production, phenotyping, genotyping, all the logistics that are involved, it's a pretty complex operation. And so because of that, you're divided into teams, and the engagement with others in the organization is quite high. In the academe, it is lower. In fact, if much of the engagement, so I'd say lower. In terms of others in the organization, it is mainly with admin, with your admin office, and support. Meaning that it's almost, at least for me anyway, it's on a needs basis. Oh, I need help with this grant. I'll ask help from our department office. Oh, I need help with, oh, the field work. I need the plot weeded or tilled today. I'm going to rely on our farm office to do that. So again, it's a different level of engagement in both organizations, at least with others within the larger organization. Your degree of independence and flexibility is low or lower when you get to the industry. And this includes time and schedule, including the amount of time that you have or your schedule. Somebody put it this way, and this might have changed with the work from home arrangements, but before work from home arrangements, if you're working with a seed company, the expectation is you'd be in the office by a certain time of day, and you'd stay in your office until a certain time of day. And that is quite different from what we see in universities, in the academe. You know, if as students, you might have been frustrated saying, oh, my professor is never in his or her office. I'd walk by and he or she isn't there. And just because of that, the flexible schedule that we have. And the level then of independence and flexibility is high, but I'd like to describe that a bit more as if when you are hired as an assistant professor, you are given a hunting license. When a fresh PhD graduate or postdoc these days is hired as an assistant professor, it's like you're told, okay, Rex, here is your hunting license. The university will pay your salary for 9 months, not 12. The university will pay your salary for 9 months. So you're never going to starve as a hunter. However, you need to hunt for your own students. You need to hunt for your own funding, because we're not going to give that to you. So to tell you a little bit about the amount of support, and I'm grateful for it here at, where I am, I receive my salary from the University of Minnesota, and I receive funding for a little less than half a technician. Okay, so if I want a full-time technician, I need to hunt for the funds that I need to cover the expenses, half expenses of that of my technician. And so here's the independence and flexibility. And this goes with a question that was posed on how big a group that you might want to have. Well, it depends what kind of hunter you are and how big a hunting group you would like to have. You know, for example, you could be more of a lone hunter. You could say, well, you know, I'm just going to have a pretty independent, you know, I'll collaborate with others as needed, but I'll stay pretty independent, and I'll have a smaller group. I'll have a smaller pack of hunters, and we'll just be, you know, 4 grad students at a time. Or you could say, no, I'd like to be part of a bigger pack of hunters. I want to be a big time hunter. I want large grants, many collaborations with others, and so forth. And then that's another type of hunter. I would have to say that I think by and large, the university administration prefers bigger hunters because they bring in more funding in terms of indirect costs. But as a professor, you cannot really be told how to do your work as long as you're successful in how to do your work, as long as you succeed in teaching, in research, and engagement. If you remain more of a medium or smaller time hunter with your hunting license, then that is perfectly fine as well. When you look at control and management from in the industry, these come from bosses. Typically, it's highly regulated. Control and management in the academe is really from yourself. And this has to do a little bit with the question on how do I move from one stage or the other? Well, it takes initiative. You're controlling, managing yourself, managing what you do, managing how you spend your time and resources. And it ties in with this previous one of it really, you dictate how your own program as a professor what suits you best and what the type of program you would like to have. For oversight and evaluation, in the industry, it is frequent. From in the academe, it probably is, it probably is more on a yearly basis. For example, at Minnesota, we are asked to give yearly reports, but that's it. We do not have to have any formal reports in the interim on every 6 months or every 3 months, a type of basis. In terms of external credit in the industry, there practically is none. By that I mean that if you work for the industry and you invent something or you develop a plant variety, you do not get the external recognition or credit for having developed that variety, because that the university would probably, if it's a I'm sorry if I spoke out of hand, but the industry internally might recognize you for being the inventor or developer of this variety. But from the outside, oh, it's just this variety from company X or company Y or company Z. Whereas external credit, obviously, in the academe is high. When we publish a paper, our name is in there. When we get a grant, our name is there. When you develop a variety, yes, it might be known as a variety developed from your university, but you do get credit. In the university news channels would put you, for example, as the inventor for that. And you would also get some of the royalties that you would generate, that would be generated from the sales of that variety, in a way that is a form of recognition. Tempo of work in the industry is fast, at least compared to the academe, where things move a lot more slowly. That you could see that on everyday work basis, but in the organization as a whole, companies can change and can change very quickly. In fact, it doesn't take too long to see how companies who were once competitors now merge and become one company, so they move fast. At the university, things move a bit more slowly. My department, agronomy and plant genetics, has had the same name since the 1920s. And I've argued we should change our name from agronomy and plant genetics to something that is perhaps more descriptive. How about Department of Crop Breeding and Agroecology? Crop breeding and agroecology describe closely what we do. But then we got pushed back. Oh no, we can't change that because that's who we are. We've had that name for 80 years now. Our alumni will get mad and that sort of thing. Camaraderie in the industry is typically high or higher. It might be lower typically in the academia, and that's because of more of the team-based nature of the work that you would see in an industry setting compared to an academic setting. And the stability is lower, and it is high in the academe, meaning that in the industry, it's not too surprising for, oh, this research station is not too productive anymore. We're going to shut down this research station, and everybody has to move here or there. You might not, that doesn't quite happen in the academe. So you have certainly more stability in the academe. And finally, in terms of salary and compensation, if we put salary and compensation in the academe as one, estimates have been that your salary in the industry would be about 1 to 2 times more if you were working in the industry. It's a very wide range. And by the way, this range here is not restricted to breeders. It is for just scientists, even engineers in general. But just in general, your salary and compensation is higher in the industry. That being said, when you're job hunting, and notice that I said here salary and compensation, because you need to look at compensation as well. When I say compensation, I'm talking about health insurance benefits. I'm looking at, you're talking about retirement contributions to your retirement fund. which are typically very generous in universities, but not as generous in the industry. So when you get your first job offer, say from the industry, make sure you ask about their compensation, their other benefits, particularly retirement, because they add up. Retirement in particular with a compounding of time, that becomes very, very significant in my opinion. So don't forget to ask about that as well. And don't forget to include that when you begin to contrast and compare. All right. I've talked enough. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're back to together as a group, and the floor is open for questions. Caitlin, yeah, you can raise your hand and I can call on you.
Hi. So I was one of the ones who's more interested in like a nonprofit sector, or even working at like an international research facility. How do you think that, I know you didn't focus on those, but how do you think they would line up in some of the key areas of these?
It's a great question. So if you're talking more about the international research centers like CIMMYT and ERIE, for example, in terms of salary and compensation, it would be lower, but it also would be higher. Let me explain that. Lower compared to salaries in the US, but higher because you're living in a place where the cost of living is a lot lower typically than in the US. And so you save a lot of money that way, and whatever you earn locally goes a long way locally. It's oftentimes in these research organizations, it's by contract. For example, I think if you're in ERIE, you get, the last time I checked, it was three years at a time, meaning that it's not, you're not on a tenure track position or long-term position. Chances are, if you're doing well and the funding, and it becomes important, and the funding is there, then your contract could be renewed, but you'd think of it as more of a contractual type of work, renewable every 3 years. Because you're working, not, chances are because you're working not in the US with these with the international research organizations, things that you might be used to in the US, you might necessarily get right away there. You know, for example, here in the US, ordering reagents, that's nothing, right? Or you ordering by Amazon, that's nothing. You go to an international research agency, and even ordering basic supplies can be difficult. And you could imagine what that does to your research program if you're relying on it for something, supplies to get the work done. And so I would say typically the pace of work is lower. It's maybe perhaps more traditional. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just stating matter of factly that things move a lot more slowly. Change might come a lot more slowly. You know, just to give you an example, in ERIE, International Rice Research Institute, until a decade ago, they were doing pedigree breeding, which has been successful in the past, but was really slow. And for them, a rapid generation advance, looking more at single seed descent in greenhouses, that was a huge deal. That was a game changer, and which made me happy and sad at the same time, because I'm thinking that's not too complicated science or breeding. You're just doing single seed descent to make things quickly. But that gives you an example of just more of the challenges. If you work in one of these places, I could only imagine that it'll be fulfilling, very fulfilling in terms of the personal satisfaction and professional satisfaction you'll get from it, because you'll be helping a lot of needy people, and you'll be developing friendships with a lot of people from around the world. And so there's a lot of fulfillment in that as well. It's a career I didn't get into. I had chances to do so, but other things with family situation and so forth, I could not do it. Yeah. Other questions? Acute, yes. Go ahead.
So in the same line from Caroline's question, in the third row, you mentioned that the job in the academia is like a hunting license. So comparing this to the non-profit job, uh, what's the funding situation there? Do you have to write your own grant, or you get the grant in certain theme and you get to work there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Depends on the nature of the nonprofit organization. If you're in a nonprofit organization such as CIMIT and ERIE, you'd have to be raising support. I don't know if it's some of it would be grants, some would be more asking for grants or gifts from a national agency like the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, for example, is a huge benefactor of work at ERIE. However, if you are with a nonprofit organization such as the Danforth Center Eurasia Funds, I'm thinking about the one out west, the Noble Foundation. Is it Noble? If you're with a nonprofit organization that has a large endowment, okay, has a large endowment from some rich person who gave money to support this nonprofit organization, then you might not have to worry as much about getting funding. I don't know if you can consider USDA as a nonprofit or organization. I'd put the USDA ARS in another whole boat that just has aspects of these different organizations. And the USDA, they do get funding, obviously, from the federal government. They do get funding for their own research, and they have line items in their budget to support technicians and so forth. Yeah. Other questions? All right. Going once, going twice.
Oh, I had a question.
Yes, Jamie.
Hi. So I am a young industry breeder, and I was curious about the criteria under control and management. Is it typical for board members and supervisors to be involved in the selection process and in the crossing decisions?
When you mean selection process for plants out in the field, or
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. So that's a great, because, well, so let me speak from experience. Before I became a professor, even before back, so I got my degree at the University of Illinois. Okay, yay, Illini. Yeah, Sarah. Then when I finished my degree, I started working with a local company. When I say local, based locally in Champaign, Illinois, called Limagrain Genetics. It's a French company. I worked there for 9 years. And it was interesting because my boss was based in France. And here I was a young 23-year-old PhD graduate on my first job. And my boss was in France. And this was before email. And this was before mobile phones. We were so excited when we got our first fax machine. It's like, wow, I can write something on a piece of paper, right? And I feed it into this machine, and my boss on the other side gets to read it. How cool is that? And then when we got our first email with a dial-up, I go, wow, this is so exciting. What a new world. But anyway, it was so different at that time. And the way my boss ran the program was, he was so involved in the selection decisions that we would fly all the way to France for meetings to go over F3 on tester trials and F5 on tester trials. And we would sit down in a big room and go through each population that was managed by one breeder. And we would, as a group, select, okay, I'll choose this one, even though we had nothing to do with creating the population or handling the population. And I'm a young guy. I'm 23, 24, and I wouldn't question that, right? It's like, okay, they're French, or this is the way they do things in this company. But after I thought about it more and got exposed to other breeding programs, I go, I don't know if I do that. I'd say, hey, breeder, choose the best lines and tell us what you think is best. And we trust your decision, and we'll go with it. And, with the really large decisions, for example, product advancement, yeah, maybe everybody has to be involved in that product advancement, because that's the pre-commercial, that's what goes to the market, or meaning, the very last part of the funnel. But the earlier funnel, personally, I don't see a reason why you hire breeders to do the work and trust them to do the work. If they're not doing the work, then get somebody else. But hire somebody and trust somebody to do that work. And I think, don't meddle with the decision. Supervise, evaluate regularly. But for me, it's don't meddle. But again, that's more of my philosophy. But I have known breeders who had more hands-on, perhaps too much of a hands-on with a lot of things going on in the program.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Other questions? All right. So with that, I propose that we take a short 3 to 4 minute break, just for everybody to get up and stretch and prevent Zoom fatigue from getting any worse. I'll just mute myself. I suggest you just mute yourself, turn off your video, but we'll be back in about 3 minutes, okay? What just happened there? Reactions, comments? Have you seen something like that before? Have you gone through something like that before? Yes, Sarah.
In our organization, we call that failure to close the loop.
Failure to close the loop. Okay.
Making sure everybody's clear on what needs to happen.
All right.
The conversation.
Okay. Other thoughts, other reactions?
It looks more to me like Latin America, like my country of origin, than US. I haven't seen that here, though, at least in the environment I am. So, because maybe we are kind of communication freaks here in the state, but in other situations, the problem is serious. Well, in Latin America, I have seen that.
Okay. Okay. Other thoughts, comments, reactions to what we saw?
Okay, I think that this is sort of misunderstanding between the two guys we just seen on the screen.
Yes, it started out that way. It started out that way, but it did not have to end that way, right? And so we're going to talk about that in detail, and we're going to dissect that a little bit in a more formal process. And so I want to share my screen and let's see. Okay, so a definition of conflict. A definition of conflict is that it is tension. Tension, it's not too bad yet. It's a dispute. Oh, that's getting serious. Or a conflagration, blow up, not in the literal sense of something going on fire, but in a way that's what we saw here, that occurs when two incompatible sets of outlooks, desires, plans, or purposes collide. I forgot the names of the actors there. One was Bill. I forget the woman's name, but they had these plans, and something happened. There was some miscommunication. They failed to close the loop, as Sarah said. And well, and the woman had this purpose of, I need to present this at the meeting. And the guy said, Bill said, no, I wasn't able to do it because you did not give me what I needed, the material I needed to accomplish the tasks. So what are some causes? Number one, well, it could be just plain, from personal perspective, selfishness or stupidity, and not being selfish and not thinking things through. It could have been a misunderstanding. It could have been a lack of clear communication, so that there's a misunderstanding. It could be that there's competition coupled with stress. And if you think about it, it's something that we do not openly talk about, for example, in the academe, but there is competition in the academe. There is competition for grants, for example, specifically when grants are funding levels are 3 to 4%. There is competition, although in that form it really doesn't lead to conflict because there's not much you can do. And the fourth could be, well, there's just an honest disagreement. There's just an honest disagreement, which does not need to lead to conflict, and yet it does lead to conflict. And conflict is just, again, it's whenever we interact with people in different kinds of situations, it can happen. And I believe that unless you and I have been hiding under a rock all these years, that all of us can speak from experience. The anatomy, if you would, of a conflict is something like this. It starts with a spark, right? It starts with a spark. And then there are two things you can do when there is a spark. One, you can snuff it out. Or two, you could pour gasoline onto it so that the spark gets bigger and it turns out into a big fire. Now, once you have this second scenario here, where you have some figurative flames, if you would, of the conflict, you can do two things. One is you could choose to not resolve it and let it be just like that. Or you can choose to proactively resolve that conflict so that your working relationship with that person with whom you've had conflict with is restored, and that you can go with the work on that you wanted to do. And so let me stop just here. And if you think of that situation, in the video we saw, what happened out there? Poured gasoline, right? Instead of snuffing, you poured gasoline on because it started out small, right? It started out small. Hey, Bill, did you have this report? And it started out small. But then they poured gasoline onto it. What are ways by which they poured gasoline onto that conflict?
I think it was a little bit of how her attitude was towards it. And I think she could have said, could we work on it together and get it done? Because it sounded like it was this afternoon, like sounded like there was some hours or there was some time in between there to where she could have said, hey, what can you get it for me within an hour? Instead of just, they just kind of went back and forth and didn't resolve anything. But that's on him too. He could have easily said, hey, well, if it's at this afternoon, I could get half of it done, or at least attempted to. Neither one of them were really trying.
That's absolutely right. They got into it and they chose this path of the conflict. I mean, the woman could have said, you know what, you're right. I said I would do this. I failed to do it, and so part of that is on me. It started with me. I made a mistake, and you could imagine how that conversation might have turned if the woman just admitted that, hey, yeah, I told you that I was going to do it, and I failed to do it for whatever reason. I'm sorry about it. Well, what can we do now? Can you help me? And instead, in the end of the conversation, if you hear how that ended, I mean, she was telling Bill that you need to be doing what you said you'd be doing. And Bill muttered under his breath, well, look who's talking, and you're not doing it yourself. So again, it's this case, and again, it's a dramatization, but we saw how instead of snuffing that conflict, they made it grow bigger to the extent that both of them were suffering in the end from that situation. And so let me share here again. There have been surveys that showed on what the effects of conflict are. And this was a survey back in almost 10 years ago now. It does have an effect on work and the quality of work. So 38% of those surveyed said they intentionally decreased work quality. Think about that. It's intentionally. It's not just a happenstance or a side effect that could not be prevented. They actually intentionally decreased work quality, decreased time of work, they decreased effort. 66% said their performance declined. 78% said their commitment to the organization declined, and 80% lost time worrying about the issue. So it is a serious issue, and it's a serious issue to be talking about. The current situation that we have, I would say, the current milieu that we have in society and in culture as a whole does not help it one bit. And in fact, the presence or the ability to communicate through, I think, social media has made that even, has compounded that. I don't know how many of you are on social media, or email everybody, of course, here, but in social media. But a problem or a difficulty with social media is that it becomes easy to share things that we might not be sharing in person, and it becomes a lot easier to intentionally or unintentionally cause conflict with others. So I'm in this social media group called Nextdoor. It's just a loose, affiliation of people who live in the community, and many of the posts, most of the posts are for lost pets. Hey, I missed Fluffy this morning, and has everybody seen Fluffy, and that sort of thing. However, there are other posts of a different nature, and I'm going to just take a bit of time to read here just to let you know. A guy named Jeff says, as I continue to drive through a subdivision, I see rare but still periodic gatherings of 30 plus people, few or no masks, and no social distancing. I wonder if we're all aware, this was back in August, the virus is still out there. It's not the flu, people. It had killed 171,000 of us, and it will kill thousands more. I thought that was fine. For the most part, it was okay. But then Bill said, we are already tracking virus outbreaks from the mindless Sturgis rally, folks. Please, please think. Oh boy, that's fanning the flames, isn't it? When you have an attitude like that. Got replies, thanks, Jeff. Sometimes I fear we're never going to get out of this pandemic. And then somebody said, Jeff, stay in your house. Oh boy, that's fanning just more flames and pouring gasoline into the whole thing. Anyway, the posts got pretty bad, and I shake my head and I go, oh my goodness, if you were talking face to face, or you probably won't be saying these things. And of course, this is a social media kind of situation, more of a neighborhood kind of situation. But you could imagine that something related to that or similar can happen in the workplace as well. Well, thankfully, we are not helpless, and that there are things that we can do when we are presented with a conflict. And there are several responses to conflict. One is to avoid it. And we avoid it by doing two things. One is we deny that the conflict existed. And I would say that that might not be a healthy thing. It probably is healthier to acknowledge, even for myself, that, yeah, that conflict happened. But that really wasn't too big of a deal in the first place. I'm just going to overlook it. I'm going to overlook it and continue to think best of my coworker. Another response is flight, meaning that then you avoid this other person. I think that is appropriate when it is accompanied by an imminent danger, which I hope would never happen in the workplace. But we do see that in domestic situations. But one way of avoiding is flight. Another response is to attack, either verbal, physical, or material, or to spread gossip, which is known as the court of public opinion. You begin to spread things about your coworker with whom you have had a conflict, or you tend to have a passive-aggressive attitude in the type of attack that you do. All right. However, there is a way that I would recommend, is that you actually address it appropriately and try to be at peace with others, in a good working relationship with others, to the extent that it depends on you and to the extent that it is possible. And I said one is to overlook. A second is to reconcile if your personal relationship with your coworker has been broken. if it is more of not a personal kind of conflict, but more of an issue kind of conflict, then there is negotiation. You can see, do we have common ground? Is this something we can negotiate or work out? If that fails, and this is in a way some sort of last resort because of what is needed, you could have mediation, formal mediation, or arbitration. Well, how do you go about doing that? There's several helpful ways to do that. One is to examine yourself first and take responsibility. I mentioned this, the woman in that video could have taken responsibility and examined herself, said, yes, it was my fault. I should have sent you this, but I did not, and I'm sorry about that. But now that we're here and I have to give a report in a few hours, is there a way you can help me? And I think that type of attitude would have been more constructive than the attitude that she displayed that led to the conflict between the two of them. Talk directly and in private, no gossip. It's helpful to provide advance notice, meaning that if you're in conflict with the other person, don't ambush and say, hey, I'd like to talk with you now, but instead say, you know what, there's this issue that I'd like to talk with you between us. Do you have time in the next few days at your convenience? And that way it gives a bit of warning and advance notice that, again, this is something that you'd like to address. And so, I mean, just ambushing can lead to an even worse situation. It helps if you can do that, again, face to face in a neutral place. And when you do that, be non-confrontational. The purpose is to not confront or further or worsen the situation further, but actually to resolve it. So you need to be respectful. You need to listen well. Even if you disagree, you need to listen well. You need to clarify, meaning that you could repeat statements by the other party. Is this what you meant? Do I understand this right? And empathize, meaning that you show that you understand and you show that you care. There were examples of assertive, non-reactive statements from our Office of Conflict Resolution here at the University of Minnesota. Yes, although Minnesotans are fairly laid back, we do have an Office of Conflict Resolution. And so statements such as I see, I feel, I hope, I expect, I mean, these are statements of empathy. And so is the second one. When you do this, I feel this because of this. And so again, these are examples of fairly low-key, non-accusatory, non-reactive statements that might be useful. It's been likened, resolution has been likened to like a graceful dance. I mean, you give, you take, you listen, you speak, you learn, you look at that other person, you look at your own self, you acknowledge your part in it as you try to have the other person try to see his or her part in the conflict that you have. And lastly, you apologize as needed to everyone involved. In your apology, there should be no ifs or buts. You do not say, I'm sorry if I did this. No, you already hurt that person. There's no reason to say if you hurt. I mean, you just say, I'm sorry unconditionally. You need to be specific about what you're apologizing for. You need to acknowledge any hurt. You need to accept any consequences. So in our video that we showed, well, the consequences, if I'm working on the report right now before the meeting this afternoon, a consequence is I need to lay aside other things that I might have put on my schedule. Perhaps maybe even cancel a meeting if I need to, so that I can help my boss have the report for this afternoon. And if it doesn't work, just the two of you, then it might be helpful to take a third party along, a third party who would be more of a neutral party and perhaps would have oversight over both of you, meaning that I wish this would never ever happen, but if it's a conflict between, say, a graduate student and an advisor or a committee member, that perhaps the department head would be involved as the third party or somebody else. Let's see. Okay. Thoughts, comments about conflict resolution, and so forth. Of course, it's easy to know all of this in a piece of paper or a document. Putting it into practice is quite more difficult. It takes time, it takes practice, it takes humility. I've been in situations where I've had to do some of these things, and you grow from it, and you become better from it, and that's the positive thing.
I had a question about tension.
Yes.
So like tension almost seems like it's like the pretense to maybe conflict. What are some ways to reduce or eliminate as much as you can tension in a workplace or something like that?
Yeah, I think one way is even just acknowledging it. Hey, is everything okay between the two of us? Is there anything that I sense there might be something that you might have been wanting to tell me? Am I correct in that, or am I just reading things incorrectly? And so it takes a bit of discernment on how to address that. But I think those might be some ways to go about it. Yes, Jenny.
I was gonna agree with you on that. The other thing, when I did a postdoc in Australia, and we had some of these type sessions, and one of the things that I learned was that, at any given time, someone's got something going on in their personal life that we know nothing about, and that's greatly influencing how they are reacting to situations in the workforce. So a lot of times, if you could just ask them if there's something going on or if there's a problem, but also saying, hey, look, are you okay? Is there something going on with you? Because it may just be as simple as them saying, hey, look, one of my parents is really sick, or I've got other things going on. And so when you understand that, you don't take it as personally as you would otherwise.
It's a great insight. Thank you, Jenny. And in this example video, I mean, it was just over the weekend, right? It happened after the weekend. It was a Monday. Who knows what happened? But over that weekend. But to your point too, I mean, when we look at the actions of others, there are situations in which we might not understand what's going on until we know the motives or what's going on. And when you understand that, then you begin to empathize, and you begin to you begin to understand more, and you get along better.
The
Go ahead,
other thing
Jenny.
the other thing I would say too is, as soon as you recognize that there's a situation, go ahead and address it, because when you don't and it festers, it's like a snowball, and it gets bigger and bigger, and then it gets to the point where it's really hard to resolve. Whereas, like you mentioned about just snuffing it out, that's really important.
Absolutely. Don't make the fire get big.
Another question I have is, how do you do this in either a situation where the group that you're involved with has different cultural influences, so addressing conflicts different in different cultures, or one where you're in a culture where you're not familiar with?
That's a very helpful insight, Carl, and that is true and extremely important. Different cultures have different ways of communicating, for example, and even the degree of, so without mentioning some cultures are a lot more direct. They'd tell you, hey, this and that, and they wouldn't even bat an eye. They're just used to saying things how they are, and no flowers and that sort. I mean, I'm trying to search for a word. No not nice talk, but it's very direct. In some other cultures, in fact, the culture I grew up in the Philippines, you hardly criticize anybody. You don't do that. In fact, to the extent that sometimes in scientific meetings, it's not productive because you have a question and you might not want to ask it because they'd think that you're criticizing somebody or you're criticizing the authors. So that cultural awareness becomes very important, and that has to always be a lens through which you look into situations such as this. It could be that this person is not being mean. It's just the way that we talk in this country that you're living in right now. All right, other questions? Okay, if not, let us move on to the next topic. I'm going to share my screen again. All right. Managing your boss. I know how if you've thought too much about managing your boss, but it's important. Part of being successful in the workplace is to work well with your boss and to manage. They say it's managing upwards rather than managing downwards. And so if you think about the boss-employee relationship, I like somebody described it, and I'm going to write it down. It's a mutual dependence. Between two fallible means prone to fault or imperfect, fallible human beings. That's the boss-employee relationship. And so if you think of, if you're a grad student, your relationship with your boss, well, that's what it is. You are depending on your boss, and your boss is dependent on you. So let's think of what are ways by which you depend on your boss, and what are ways by which your boss depends on you. Let's have the floor open and just share answers to that question. How do you depend on your boss? How does your boss depend on you? If you want to write down answers in chat, you're free to do so as well, if that's more convenient or quicker for you.
Your advisor's kind of responsible for making sure that when you're doing research, you're going in the right direction. Okay. Your advisor is, yes, responsible is making sure that, you know, your experiments are sound, scientifically sound, that that it'll lead to work that is a good contribution to the science and to the body of knowledge in the literature. Yes. What else? Your boss is responsible that you get paid. I like that. Oh, yes. Okay.
I think I would add there's almost a division of labor component where a boss certainly has a different view. I think you mentioned previously when you're in different stages, they have maybe a more big picture outlook, and you're helping accomplish the ins and outs of the big picture, but you may not necessarily have the benefit of being in their position to see the larger picture. And that helps you inform what you're doing on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis, whereas you're helping support what they're doing at an overarching large scale.
Yes. Imagine, if you would, imagine that you are a grad student, or imagine yourself back in your grad student days. And if you just completely dropped your research project, right? What would have that done to the overall research focus or program of your boss? It would have suffered, right? Because your boss is relying on you to do your research project well, to come up with peer-reviewed publications, to come up with research results that can serve as data to have the next grant proposal, for example. So yes, even though you might not think of it that way when you're a grad student, your boss depends on you quite heavily, actually. In the same manner, you obviously depend on your boss to pay you, to give you direction. You know, I mentioned that in that stage one, that having a good mentor is very much a key, and part of that mentorship is increasing your network of professionals in the field who you're in contact with. So a big part of what your boss does for you is introduce you to others in the field who your boss knows but you don't know yet. And so, I mean, there are a lot of things that you need to depend on your boss from. And so what I'd like to do now in the next several minutes is for each of you to go through these boxes here and try to fill these out to the extent that you can, right? So if you think of yourself and your current boss, what are some goals and pressures that your boss might have, that you might have, strengths and weaknesses that you might have, your boss might have, but don't share that with a group? What are organizational objectives or objectives of the organization as a whole that you work for, and so forth. And there's a second sheet here. If you could fill out this sheet too, I'll give you, let's say, about just 10 minutes to do that. And then we're going to talk about it together as a group. Okay? That's the assignment, the seed work at this time. Okay, I'll give you just a minute or two to finish up. All right. Let's have everybody back. If you could turn your videos back on again. Let's talk about this as a group. So, managing your bosses or working well with your bosses requires a good idea of expectations. It requires a good idea of what your bosses might be going through in terms of goals or pressures, for example, in terms of supporting objectives of the organization, as well as personal objectives. It takes a good awareness of your boss's mode of operation, for example. Is your boss more of a listener and speaker, or does your boss prefer to read written formal Word documents or PDF documents? Or would your boss prefer a PowerPoint presentation and these sorts of things? So let's talk about this a little bit. If you think of your boss and yourself, what might be some of the goals and pressures that you may have and your boss may have? Are those in line with each other, or are they actually in conflict with each other? Would anybody want to share what they might have written down? Chat is fine too if you prefer chat. Don't be shy.
Okay, I can share. I work in cotton. I work for a nonprofit. My boss's goals and what she does are a lot bigger in scope. She has to worry about a lot larger picture of the industry. I concentrate on research. While we're very aligned, it creates different perspectives on what priorities can be. So we clearly, while we're on the same path, we have completely different ways of looking at things sometimes.
Thank you for sharing that. Nolan shared, we both want to publish quality research as fast as possible. That's great. If that's a common goal and pressure, I mean, that's a great position to be in. I can share from my perspective, when my immediate boss is my department head, and some of the current goals and pressures my department head are facing. One is budget and COVID-19, and those go hand in hand. And so when COVID-19 hit, wow, we need to do all these procedures of social distancing in the field, of having only one person per vehicle when you go to an outlying location. If I'm on a planter, riding a planter with a colleague, what do I do? Do I put plexiglass between us, and that sort of thing? Those are the pressures my department head was dealing with. And another is budget, with budget, how COVID-19 has affected the budget of the university, and that trickles down. I mean, he's facing budget cuts for our department. So those are some of the pressures he's facing. For me, along those lines, it's a bit of unspoken, but as a faculty member, you always feel pressure, at least I do, to get grant money. Why? Because of indirect costs. So if I get a grant from the USDA or some other organization, there's quite a substantial amount of indirect costs that get paid to the university and that we use to pay for lights and utilities and other sorts of things. And my pressure is, well, I've never been good at writing grants. I've resigned myself to that fact. Many of my previous grants have been high priority but unfunded, and it becomes quite frustrating. And then I could tell myself, hey, you know what? I actually don't need grant money to publish research because I do a bit of theoretical and modeling and data mining kinds of work. Hey, I can work with existing data sets or do simulation result projects like I have. And I don't have to find money, except if I want a grad student, of course. But then, if our main criterion if a main criterion would be grant funding rather than student support, publications rather than student support, and that's something else. And so again, that's just some of the expectations I think that we need to be aware of that our bosses might be facing, because yes, they might be the same as ours, or they might be different from ours. Okay. Let's go down to preferred means of getting information. Would anybody like to share on that? How do you prefer to get information? Do you prefer talking or listening, formal PowerPoint, written materials? And how about your boss? Have you thought about that? Anybody want to share? We don't know your boss, so it's okay.
I think I could share that. I work for a small private company, and it's a family company. So there's the complicated aspect of not only working for your boss, but also being related to your boss. So maybe that's another conversation for another day. But I know temperament styles, he's in much more of an entrepreneurial role. So the least amount of information possible is best for him. So as far as basically actionable 2 or 3 tidbits, whereas for me, being on the research side of things, I want to give the entire 15-minute proposal, and that's not necessarily feasible in a given time frame. So that's been a good thing for me to learn in the past few years, is to try to be more sensitive to how he needs to receive information. Again, being at a different level and having different pressures and concerns, to where he doesn't need the whole story, but just the 1 or 2 tidbits that he needs to act on in the
just the bottom line.
That's right.
Yeah. Nicole here. Nicole, thank you, Nicole. Wrote, I like a mixture of written and talking listening, while my boss likes written materials and memos. I recall my advisor in grad school, he preferred just talking. And one of my co-office mates preferred memos. And he would write a memo to my advisor. And I heard one day my advisor shaking his head. I don't know why Rod writes me these memos. He could just go upstairs 2 flights of stairs and talk with me. But yeah, that brings a point. Okay, let's take this specific instance. And that's the last question on the handout. What happens if your boss's style differs from yours? What would you do?
Okay, I can go a little bit here. When you talk about communication styles, a lot of people perceive anything that's in writing as in writing. It can be used against you in the future. So if you make a mistake, there's always the fear and mistrust about how it can be used against you. That said, after COVID-19 hit, it's pretty much become a blank space. You write everything. You send emails for everything. One of the ways I worked around people who used to like to just talk to me and make sure things are not documented, that they requested things from me. We created a space called water cooler on our messengers. And we introduced it as this is a space where you can have a discussion. And so if you have an opportunity to talk to somebody, that becomes your open space. Now, everyone's had to adapt in the past year and a half, or at least a year, to just simply send emails. And we've tried to resolve the whole talking about thing by keeping a separate writing space, a messenger space, a social space for people to still be able to talk to each other private and as a group.
That's a interesting, creative way of going about it. I never thought of that point. That yes, if you write something down, that can be held against you. But if it's not written, then that's not possible. I remember there was a time when I was asked to be an expert witness for a company, but the company said, "Rex, I don't want you to send anything written." And so we did everything by phone, and it was painful because things that would have been so easy to write down, everything was by phone, and that was just a painful process. But I do get the point. Now, if I think my recommendation is that if my boss's style were different from mine, then I would have to adapt to my boss, because part of my job is to help my boss be successful. If my boss is successful, then I would like to think that I become more successful too, and the organization becomes more successful too. And these aren't things that are too hard to do, and so I would adapt to my boss. However, if you're a boss as well, you must also be willing to give leeway, and maybe even adopt to the way that somebody who reports to you does things. One of my favorite students, I still lament that she has graduated, but she was extremely sharp. But each time we had a meeting, she would bring a PowerPoint presentation. And I'm saying, you know what? I don't need a PowerPoint. At first, I told her, I don't need a PowerPoint presentation. Let's just talk. But, the meetings, happened, and she would still have a PowerPoint. And I did not check with her if this was the case, but it dawned on me, you know what? I think that's just her preferred mode of communication. And it's just easier for her to convey her ideas if she puts it in a PowerPoint. So I shouldn't look at it as if, hey, you're doing work you don't need to do because you're making a PowerPoint, but rather you're putting in the work because that helps you to communicate better with me. And so I said, okay, I'll go with that. I'll sit through a PowerPoint presentation, even though I don't like it. This is just me personally. There's actually a political party in Switzerland called the Anti-PowerPoint Party, and I became a part of it not too long ago, because there were times when I can't take it anymore. But PowerPoint does have its role when used. When used well. And so there are other things, again, that you could think about, frequency of reporting, level of formality, how formal does my boss want to be? How about pace and awareness of time? Does your boss tend to ramble? Or is more, hey, let's get this going because we have a next meeting to go to? Or as Dylan mentioned, the level of detail. Does your boss want detail? Or does your boss just want to be told the bottom line? He wasn't my boss, but he was a boss in the sales company of Limagrain at that time. Very interesting guy. Basically, he said, for the hybrids that we're selling, what would really help me is a star rating system. Is this a 5-star hybrid or a 4-star hybrid or a 4.5-star hybrid, without really having to go too much into details at that time? And I go, oh, that's a pretty interesting way of putting things. That's pretty creative. But again, it's more of an awareness of how your boss works, and trying to adapt to that to the extent that you can. A few things that I'd like to mention. One is make sure that to the extent possible, don't give surprises to your boss. Have as few surprises as possible with your boss, and have a good flow of information. Have a good flow of information. One incident that I recall about this no surprises I really appreciated was one of my graduate students. He had two populations, population A and population B. Population A needed to be analyzed with markers set population A with marker set 1 and population B with marker set 2. He made a mistake. He had told the provider to analyze population A with marker set 2 and population B with marker set 1. And I go, oh no, you know, there goes all the time down the drain, the money down the drain. It was a bad situation. But I was very appreciative that he told me right away as soon as it happened, so that there were no surprises later on and we were able to work the situation out. So make sure there are as few surprises as possible, make that flow of information go. Second, advise, provide your input, but then obey, meaning advise your boss, give input, give useful input. But once your boss makes that decision, because he or she is your boss, then you need to go along with that. The important thing is that I hope that there's a process in place so that differing opinions can be expressed. So you could provide advice, you could express your opinion, but once you've had that forum to express that opinion or advice, then where it boils down to, well, if there's only one decision that can be made, it's your boss who makes that decision. And along with that, try not provide solutions rather than complaining, meaning that if something is wrong, yes, you can point out that something is wrong, but at the same time, you provide, okay, this is wrong, but this is one way that we can fix this. And again, with many things, a lot of it is expectation. Knowing what your boss expects of you and knowing what knowing what to expect of your boss. And for if you're a faculty member, and I haven't done this yet, but I would like to, if you're a faculty member, what's actually useful is a document that you would prepare, a written document that you would give to new graduate students who would join your program, with the expectations that you would specify, okay, if you join, now that you're part of my group, this is what you would expect. Things such as, I have an open door policy for you, and you can come by at any time. If I'm not in, if I'm busy, I might say come back, but I have an open door policy. Or your policy might be, I can't do open door, but if you give me a day's notice, I probably could meet with you right away the next day. And so it's more of an understanding of what the expectations and the rules of engagement are with your boss that really is quite important for you to manage upwards. Any comments, questions before we take our second quick break? All right, seeing and hearing none, let's take a 3-minute break here again. Stay in the Zoom meeting, do not leave unless you really wanted to leave, but that's okay. And I will see you in about 3 minutes for the last third of our meeting this afternoon. Okay, everybody hanging in? One more hour, we're in the home stretch. All right, so the last two topics that we'll be talking about this afternoon are communication and meetings. Of course, meetings are one way of communicating, and they take more and more of our work week, it seems like. So let's start with this effective communication. And if you're interested, the main reference that I've used for this part of the workshop is this nature.com article. So what is communication? I'll be writing on this handout here. Communication is all about getting your message across to a particular audience, getting your message across to a particular audience. There are two key nouns over here. One is the particular audience to whom you're communicating, and we'll talk about that later on. And the second part, which is a key part, is this message. You would notice that it says message. It does not say getting your information or getting information across to a particular audience. It's getting a message across to a particular audience. Information asks the question, what? What did you find out? What is it? What's going on? What is information? Message answers the question, so what? And so when we say so what, it's an interpretation of the information is what we're after. And so when you hear of the term messaging, and the term messaging might not have as good a reputation as one might like, messaging is actually positive in the sense that you've thought about who am I speaking to or writing to, or speaking to or writing to, for example, and what is the message that I'd like to get across. The idea being that the information actually might not be too much or might not be relevant per se, but if it's not information but actually a message that you are imparting or delivering, then it becomes a lot more effective. The medium is important because there certainly are differences between written and oral communication. If we think of written communication, with written communication, readers can be selective. Meaning that, well, if there's a written document, a reader may choose to focus on one section and focus more on another section. And we do that when you and I read scientific papers, right? We can be selective. We can choose to only read the title. And if we decide, say, oh, the title's it's not really that interesting to me, then we don't read the rest of it. We may read the title and then we might start reading the abstract. And if that remains interesting, then we might decide to read the rest of the paper. And even in reading the rest of the paper, it might vary. We may skim through the materials and methods and focus on the discussion, for example. So the point with written communication is that readers can be selective. Readers can go back, meaning that if I'm reading a paper and I'm at the discussion section and I'm not quite understanding something, I might go back, say, to the materials and methods so that I could understand now what I wasn't understanding earlier in the discussion section. You can include details here in a written document. You can have as much or as little detail as possible. And I think when we talk about scientific writing these days, we're including more and more detail in the sense that papers are getting longer, for sure. Papers are getting longer. And also we now have supplemental material to the main document, which we did not have just only a few decades ago. So those are aspects of written communication. In contrast, when we're talking about oral communication, the listener cannot be selective. I mean, listener can be selective in the sense of tuning out and not listening to you, but you get the point that you don't have that amount of selectivity. You're there listening to the speaker for the appointed amount of time. If it's oral communication, then the listener cannot choose the order. I talked about a scientific paper. I can read the title, the abstract. I can go to the conclusions, the discussion, read back. If it's an oral presentation, then the order is whatever the speaker chooses is the order. And typically, the audience would have less interest in details. Part of it is, well, you can only capture so much of what you hear or retain so much of what you hear. And so therefore, naturally, a speaker would also tend to share less details. I've actually been thinking about this very point here lately. If you think of most of the scientific presentations that we would give or that we would hear, they pretty much follow the written order, right, for a scientific paper. If you go to a scientific seminar or meeting presentation, you'll have the title, of course, and then you'll have some sort of introduction, materials and methods, and then a results and discussion and conclusions. But I'm thinking, why does it have to be that way? It actually doesn't have to be that way. And I think there actually are better ways to present scientific information that is far different from the way that we would write a paper. So for example, for my own students in my group, I've encouraged them, don't structure your seminar presentations like you would a paper. Instead, say, okay, this is my title. This is the general nature of the problem or introduction. Then I tell my students, okay, think about, let's say, 3 main points that you would like the audience to retain. And so the student might say, okay, this is my finding number 1 or conclusion number 1. And then the student would go into what things about this finding or conclusion number 1, including some materials and methods. And then finding number 2 or conclusion number 2, and finding number 3, and then a general conclusion. So you get the point that it's not the introduction, materials, then results, but it's more of what's the take-home message. Focus first on the take-home message, and then drill down to the sufficient level of detail in each of those take-home messages that you've shared. And personally, I think that our meetings will be a whole lot better if we adapt that way of communication, focusing on the take-home message rather than the traditional way that we were trained to do with writing a scientific paper. Okay. What message? What message does the audience want to hear? What you need to focus on is not what you want to do with what you convey. Again, not what you want to do, with what you convey, but with what you want the audience to do, It's always about the audience. Meaning that you need to focus on the audience and you need to have a good idea of who your audience is. Never approach a meeting, for example, or a seminar or anything like that without having a good idea of who your audience is, because knowing the audience is key before you can craft what message you want to impart. How you should communicate includes several things. Switch here. For example, are you communicating to a small or to a large audience? If it's a smaller audience, you can get by with a less formal presentation, more intimate, friendly town hall talk kind of presentation. If it's large, chances are it would tend to be more of a formal type of presentation. Then now, with COVID-19, it's in person or online. And we're finding out that online communication, there's a lot of nuances with online communication that we didn't have to think about with in-person communication. Things such as reading mannerisms and facial expressions and so forth. They don't, and eye contact, they don't quite come across the way we might want to with online communication as opposed to in-person communication. When you're communicating with specialists versus non-specialists, that's something you need to know. And how do you do that? How do you do that when you're communicating with non-specialists versus specialists? A key thing to remember with non-specialists is that they lack reference points. For example, if you tell a non-specialist audience of bushels per acre, the audience the audience would know what an acre is most likely, but might not know what a bushel is. What's a bushel? And so you'll need to explain, oh, a bushel is about a laundry basket or something like that. And so people would know, a non-specialist would know how big a laundry basket is. And by providing that reference point, basically what you need to do is to use analogies as a helpful way of communicating with non-specialists. Analogies are a powerful tool. And then it might be that it's not one or the other, but it is a mixture of the two. And one practice when you're communicating with a mixture of specialists and non-specialists is for you to start with a broader picture. Start with a broad picture. And then you drill down. And then you could leave details to questions, for questions. Meaning that if you're given a pretty, if you're giving a talk on a pretty complicated experiment, feel free to leave details. If there are questions about the details that somebody really needs to know, that you could do that during the Q&A, or you could say, you know what, it's a good question, a very specialized, why don't you and I talk later on after the meeting so that I can explain in greater detail, okay? So what I'd like to do now in this remaining time of our segment is to divide the group into breakouts. What I'd like you to do is to think about your current research. Think about the research you're doing. And then for each of the audiences below, what messages might you wish to convey? You know, for example, what if you're talking with your next door neighbor whose knowledge of biology is limited to a high school course taken 20 years ago? Or what if you're talking with Bill Gates? What would you tell Bill Gates about your research? So I'm going to divide, or Niha, do you need to do this? Let me stop sharing. Divide it into breakouts.
I'll go ahead and do that. Do you know how many people?
How about 3 per group? So the instructions to the breakout, just take turns, write your key message, then take turns reading what you said. Okay, I'm talking with Bill Gates. This is what I'll tell Bill Gates.
I'll create 11 breakout rooms. So we have
that sounds good.
3 people in each. Okay. Did everybody get a message to go in, or? Okay.
Niha, room 11 has only 1, and so probably reassign 11 to number. One of them had only. I'm not joining 2 right away, so you could join somebody, put somebody on 2.
I went and reassigned. I think there's at least 3 in every room now.
Room 7 has 1, but hasn't joined yet though. So
I'll move them to.
Okay, nice to meet you. How's it going, Neha?
Yeah.
You to share your message as if you were talking to Bill Gates on Zoom. That being said, and that's an exercise I do in my class, and it's a lot of fun when we're meeting face to face. One thing that I'd like to emphasize is, again, know your audience and what your audience would like to hear. And so I shared this with a group that I was in. If I'm speaking with Bill Gates, I need to think if I'm in Bill Gates' shoes, what might I like to hear about what I'm doing? And so you need to know a little bit about Bill Gates. He's very involved, as we know, in international agricultural development through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so one way of conveying your message to Mr. Gates is to see how your work might be related to that. How your work might be related to in plant breeding, might be related to international agricultural development. And that would be completely different from if you were talking to somebody in your state legislature, because your state legislator would be less concerned with international agricultural development, rather as opposed to development and jobs and productivity of your state. So if you're talking to somebody in your state legislature, you're focusing on how your work impacts your state rather than someplace around the globe. If you're speaking with a dean for a job you're interviewing, as assistant professor, you need to think, okay, what would the dean want to hear from me so that my prospects of getting a job might be even a bit better? And so you need to share, okay, this is how my work complements the work in the college as a whole. This is how I can collaborate. My work leads to collaborations with professors X, Y, and Z in departments A, B, C, and so forth. And with a dean, I would be talking less about, you know, international ag development. I still might do that, but you get the point that you need the message that you share always has to be accurate and truthful, obviously, but you need to tailor it to the audience that you have. Okay. With that, in the remaining few minutes that we have, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this topic of meetings. I'm going to share my screen once again. I designed this last handout as a fairly standalone kind of handout. I thought that, okay, if we run out of time, you can pretty much read this on your own. But just briefly, 38,000 respondents in Microsoft about 15 years ago said that ineffective meetings, and that's an important word, adjective here, not meetings, but ineffective meetings are the #1 time waster in the workplace. At that time, they had a mean of about 5.6 hours of meeting per week. That might be more now. And of course, most of the meetings are done by Zoom this time. There's some references here that I've used and referred to in the past for effective meetings, but let's go through some points bit by bit. #1, schedule only those that are necessary. Meet only when you have to. One way of knowing when you have to meet is when your email exchanges become too cluttered. And now you'd say, well, okay, this is just too much clutter. Let's just meet to resolve this thing once and for all. Meetings are also necessary when there are important decisions that need to be made, and there has to be a clear process for getting engagement from everybody. So everybody's input and everybody's opinions are taken into account. A meeting is a good way to do that. And again, but compare it to versus resolving things by email or a phone call or just by one-on-one. And again, invite only those who need to be in that meeting, and don't invite more people than you need to. Yeah, I mentioned that here. You might need to meet as a process and for getting buy-in and consensus. My opinion is that a main function of meetings is to make decisions. We meet mainly to make decisions. There are things such as status update meetings that do allow questions to be asked, but to the extent possible, try to minimize those. If you have status meeting updates, make those brief. My son works with an artificial intelligence startup in Munich, Germany, and they have status update meetings every day, I believe. But the way they do their meetings is, #1, nobody sits down. Everybody just stays standing so that the meeting doesn't go long, and they go very quickly through each one in that meeting with a set of questions. What did you do yesterday? What were some challenges from what you did yesterday? And what do you plan to do today? Only those three things. Beyond that, it would be for another purpose. So that's a good way of getting status. What you do yesterday, what you're going to do today, what issues are you facing, and everybody just standing up. As I mentioned, invite only those who need to be at the meeting. They say that a meeting of 4 to 7 is best. If you're a dozen, that's about pushing it. One way to get around that is to subdivide the agenda as needed, meaning that you might have a 90-minute slot for the meetings. Okay, first 30 minutes, 8 people come to this meeting, this first 30 minutes. Second 30 minutes, 4 of those leave, 3 come in, and 7 meet. And then you get the picture. The third part of the meeting is that, well, somebody might rotate off the meeting. And that is assuming, again, that not everybody has to be there for everything that is discussed during the meeting. Number 4, always have a clear agenda, have a clear idea of what you need to talk about. Circulate background materials in advance. This is a rule of thumb. If possible, keep the meetings to 90 minutes, better yet an hour. Be conscious of time. Again, if there are 7 people in your meeting and you've wasted 10 minutes, then you've wasted about 70 minutes of time there. There's been suggestions, start with the most creative parts early, with the heavier parts toward the end. Start with areas of unit of common items rather than those that might cause division. Again, with this important reminder that just because you disagree doesn't mean that you need to be not united in the work that you're doing. Avoid trivia. Terminate if you're the leader of the if you convene the meeting, you need to keep tabs on how it's going and to be able to terminate or cut a specific discussion as needed. Number 7, be aware of meeting dynamics, and for that I'm going to stop sharing my screen and show this video. So Niha, if you could pause the recording while I show. All right, get back here. Chances are you haven't been to a meeting that worse, but that bad, but it just gives you an idea of meeting dynamics and what you, as somebody who's called the meeting or convened the meeting, might have to deal with. Other pointers are listed in the handout. I think that number 8 is useful but hard to do. Ban mobile devices, ban your cell phone during a meeting. If there might be a way of pulling that, but everybody has to agree to do that. So with that, I'd like to end the discussion about meetings here and just have at least 10 minutes in the end to address any general questions that you might have about anything that we've talked about this afternoon or did not talk about this afternoon. You can raise your hand and I can call on you. Yes, Jose. Oh, okay. I got it. Any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I'll make a comment. And this is something that I really have started implementing in my class at Auburn. Is just how valuable teamwork is to you. And you know, you talk about communication, but if you figure out how to work with other people and figure out their personalities and how to communicate effectively, teamwork can take you very far. And I've been quite successful in that. And I try to, I've even got to the point where in my class, I teach it in a team format. And you're with your team the entire way through the class. And then the final is individual. But, and I tell them, you know, we as breeders, we know how to improve our crop, but we don't necessarily know the trait that we're working with. So we have to work with other people. I mean, that's just an essential part of our job. And I think if you can figure out how to talk to other people and not be afraid to pick up the phone and call somebody, it can really push you to that next level you know, that Rex talked about early on in the about what stage you're at.
Thank you, Jenny. To piggyback on what you said, yes, and that also deals with, you know, as breeders, we say, yeah, we need to know our germplasm, right? If you don't know your germplasm, then you cannot be successful. And it's the same thing with working with people. You got to know the people that you're working with, and people are different. And so one thing that I do with all of my students automatically, the moment they join my team, is I ask them to take a strengths finder assessment. So I know if, again, it's one of these tests that tells how a person is wired. And so strengths finder, it tells you how you're wired. And so some of my strengths, if you would, I think my number one is strategic. I'm number one, strategic. I'm high on belief, responsibility, ideation, and I'm also a learner. I like to learn things. And so I make my students do that. And I found that one of my student, he was very high in command and significance and competition. And I go, okay, Nick, that's how you're built. I'm going to treat you like a general. I'm going to give you tons of work, and I'm going to give you a lot of responsibility, and I'll be very direct with you, because you're built like a general, I think, and you're going to thrive on that. And he absolutely did. My other students who were not like that, they were more analytical, more deliberate, more harmony. I go, oh, I cannot, I need to treat you in a different way. But by giving that test proactively, I saved myself a lot of time and effort trying to learn something about my students. Plus, they also learned about me because I shared my own strengths from this assessment. So it doesn't have to be that. And I think there was a question on what that was. I'm going to write it now. It's Strengths Finder by Tom Rath. So things that you can do like that, I think would be helpful for building your team as well. I wish I could give that to my boss, but I don't have that authority to do that, right?
Yeah, a question.
Other questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
It's more like a question for you about your experience during your career. So when you from the time you started your career to now, there has been so many changes in technologies and within science as well. So many new methodologies to to study the questions emerged, and you have compiled so many things in your textbook as well. So what's your attitude towards it? How do you perceive the changes and to internalize it so that you can have a better understanding of it every time new things come up?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. As you mentioned, the field of plant improvement has changed tremendously from the time I got my PhD degree in 1988 to where it is now. I mean, back then, the marker of choice was RFLPs, restriction fragment length polymorphisms. A high density map was about 200 markers. That was high density back then, and the costs were about $2 per data point. There were no drones. The computers were slow and clunky and so forth. So certainly, as you said, a lot has changed. And I think what each of us needs to do is to become avid learners, to continue to learn and to be willing to learn. So I think what we do need in our graduate education is a good foundation. It's a good foundation in genetics, a good foundation in plant breeding, a good foundation in statistics, a good foundation in professional skills such as these, a foundation that you can build on as the years go by, as new science comes to the fore, that you can build on that foundation and that you can continue to learn based on the foundation that you have laid. So if you know my work, for example, a lot of the work that I have done has to do with mixed model analysis and best linear unbiased prediction. I learned zero of that in my PhD work. I've heard about it. I avoided it like the plague because I did not understand it and I didn't know what these crazy animal breeding colleagues in my class were doing. But once I got to my work, I go, oh, okay, there's use. I can see this use for this one. We can use it for hybrid prediction. And so then, I had a good enough background in basic matrices and matrix algebra. And so it's just by learning from others have written that I picked it up. And I wish I could say that about every field there is. My foundation in genomics or molecular genetics is certainly a lot weaker. I mean, I know Mendelian genetics very well, but talk to me about more of the molecular or biochemical genetics. I'm quite weak in that, and I cannot learn on my own, which is fine, because you get to a certain field, you do need to specialize, right? You do need to specialize. But that's my encouragement, is just lay a strong foundation and then develop an attitude of learning, which is, again, admittedly harder and harder to do these days, just because so many papers are being published. I cannot keep up. I cannot keep up with the papers that are being published. I personally think too many papers are being published. And why is that? Well, it's just because of the pressure for academics to publish their work. And I don't think it's healthy. So, long answer to your question, but very good question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernardo.
Other questions? All right. Well, I see none. So thank you very much for your attention today, for joining us. Neha, if you're there, I think I'll give the floor back to you as the organizer of this workshop.
Thanks a lot, Rex. We really had a good time. I appreciate you taking out that many hours and hosting all of us and teaching us. If you have feedback, all of you attendees can send it out to the NAPB Gmail that you guys got registered with. And if you have any other questions for Rex, well, then that's his problem.
That's right.
Y'all have a nice rest of the weekend, and thanks for joining today.
All right.
Thank you.